But I had asked panelists to think about questions they can ask to each other. My own experience is that the panelists, because they've thought about the topic and so on, they can ask better questions to each other than probably we could, potentially. So I still want to give them an opportunity. If they have any questions or comments they want to make on each other's presentations or points of view, welcome to do it. Any one of you? Amin, go.
I can make a comment on Peter's presentation, which I really enjoyed. I think you made this great point about open versus closed. One of the things I'll point out, though, is going through your examples, Apple's closed model. A5 is an ARM processor. iOS is FreeBSD derived. Yep. And their apps are hundreds of thousands of folks who pay 30% of their revenue to Apple, to listings in the App Store, right? So all these things were open derived and then closed. We don't have the open-derived bit in software-defined networking yet, but if some company starts off with something open and decides to close it, so be it. I think the VMware example is very interesting. We're at Stanford, so who here has heard of Disco or SimOS? Right. So research project here at Stanford that led to VMware. Zen, of course, was open source, and you can still get it open source. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty certain that Amazon isn't paying any money to Citrix for Zen. So I think open first makes sense. And if there are companies that decide to get really wealthy by closing something off down the road, so be it.
Okay. Any other comments, questions to each other? So, because I'm chairing the panel, I think I can ask one more question before I open it up to the audience. So I guess Scott also mentioned, Scott in his opening keynote talk mentioned that networking community has to change and it has to become more software. We have to change our culture from whatever it is, networking culture. Greg, you are mentioning the same point that we have to bring more developers and so on, and that is when you would get more excited about it. So how does this happen? Is there a recipe? Is there, I mean, we are going to learn by making all the mistakes, or we can learn something from either the web community or software community or whatever. So do you want to say something about it?
Yeah, well, it happens through lots of little things. Value has to come from it, but it's got to get seeded, and I think it can happen through this summit, actually the next one in April, maybe emphasizing developers as a segment on it and starting to raise our consciousness about toolpaths and APIs and what's going on in there and how one contributes in it. I think that's actually an area where you want a lot of openness to.
Yeah, please.
But I can comment from mobile perspective, right? There are a couple of examples in mobile side. One is a soft switch to media gateway migration. Where the intelligence has been centralized in the soft switch, and it's more of a software focus. And the second one that Ericsson has done, especially when it comes to mobile broadband, there's something called GGSM. So what we have done was we developed mobile applications, and then we put in on third-party routers. Mm-hmm. In this case, Juniper. We have taken Juniper M-series router, and we basically embedded mobile applications to enable a mobile broadband gateway. And the sales model is based on software-based licensing. It's not based on the hardware chassis and all that kind of stuff. So it's a licensing model. So there are two successful models within telecom industry with respect to soft switch, as well as the mobile broadband gateway in terms of software-based approaches.
But don't you think that in the soft switch, that community of vendors or so on was pretty small? So how do we do it at a much larger scale is the issue. How do we engage a much larger software development community to participate and contribute and create products and so on?
Absolutely. I think that I think we have to learn from the success stories, and we have to broaden that or expand, that's for sure. But I just wanted to say that there are a few examples that we can learn and expand.
Peter, you want?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I've spent a lot of the last decade going back and forth between these two communities. And in this meeting, there's been discussion about classic networking being distributed systems. And I think that's really a poor analogy, because if you look at the internet, the magic of how today's networking works is the autonomy of design in all these boxes. And the problem I see that you have to eventually bridge is people in the networking community don't understand, to distributed systems. It's completely foreign. They've been deeply steeped in this idea of you do things without sharing any state. You not only do it without sharing any state, but you use rigidly controlled, standardized protocols. So if you go to Cisco, let's just take Cisco for example, you couldn't find a more software intense company. I mean, the vast majority of all their engineers are software engineers. They do a huge amount of software development, but they work in this paradigm that's completely different from a distributed computing paradigm. And I really, maybe we should adopt technology from the Cultural Revolution, and you send them all out to work in the fields in Fresno and then bring them back and retrain them as engineers. But it's a very different, it's a whole different technical culture. The support community for people like Cisco are people who are trained to specialize in knowing how to use the details, but not to think about how to program. It shouldn't be underestimated as what it takes to change these cultures and move from one to the other.
Gang, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think the architecture and the culture is one aspect. I see the lack of collaborative development in the networking side, software development in the networking side, attributes more to the development model and the business model today in the networking industry. So you don't have a open, if we compare to the computing side, we don't have the equivalent of a open operating system to allow people to develop applications on top of it. We don't have tools. We don't have many of the languages that's tailored towards the characteristics of network applications. So those need time to gradually build up. I think many people referred to Jen's talk earlier yesterday. I like that too. So that's an indication of we need to look not only the SDN, not only from a pure architecture point of view, but from a development community, development model perspective. I think it is those tools / a community-owned or open type of operating system that can help us to enable this movement from a developer's perspective.
Yes, and maybe you have to clone Jane and have more of her so she can more tools. But I think even, I mean, in fairness, right, there is a Knox, Beacon, there are all these network operating systems are there. And on top of that, yes, the kinds of tools Jane is building, and if there are more way to happen, then that would be nice. Anyway, I think enough. So I want to take questions from the audience now and see whether you guys want to have any questions.
I have some questions. Sergio from Orange. So I'm going for Peter. I saw in one of your slides you mentioned open source routing, no for enterprise and maybe for network operator. I'm trying to understand what's the rationale considering running IPTV on an open source router.
What I meant to point out is and maybe the better term to look at is this DevOps model where you really integrate operations with development. That's what the big web properties run on to great advantage. I could imagine that kind of interaction occurring in some of the large network operators because what they do in the network is so critical to the business that hiring top level system engineers and having them in the middle of the dynamic operation of the network, although it would be a big difference from how they operate historically, the value is there. What I was trying to point out is I think in the enterprise, the idea of that top-level system engineers will be at the core of running the network team for most enterprises. It just won't happen because the network is critical to every business, but not differentiating. So in this management categorization, it's something that you want to get done, but if you could outsource it or deal with another vendor, you would. It's not something you would want to bet your existence on having the right people. So it's a question of if you take this model, where could you expect the level of expertise to exist that you might be able to run in something that looked like the DevOps model, as attractive as it may be?
I can ask one simple question to Ericsson. So I'm still trying to figure out use cases for service provider for the SDN. There were some use cases. I think they are going after something that we already do it. For example, like video distribution. CDN are coming very cheap, and we are building some optimized architecture for that. Why don't we solve some problem that we have really now today? For example, take the RAN, Radio Access Network. There is this Wi-Fi offload with this 3G and 4G LTE. We spend $500 million for LTE spectrum. So why don't we try to apply for service provider SDN for really existing problem today? And I think Ericsson, being in the RAN business, should look at those type of problem and application rather than going after something like a CDN or video distribution or IMS. So my solicitation to just look for service provider existing pain points. I think SDN will be still tough for us.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned one of the use case scenarios we are looking at is traffic steering. So that's what you mean. So how do we do traffic offload onto the low-cost links, including the Wi-Fi? So that's one of the use case scenarios. Absolutely, it's part of it.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question about the enterprise. One of the issues that enterprises face is the fact that their budgets are being squeezed. So that's one issue. Then the other thing that I can't help but think about a lot is, the dog and the tail and who's wagging who. Well, the servers and the applications running on the servers are of paramount importance to the operation of the business and to the survival of the business. So if the network is an impediment in the sense of it's not flexible enough, it takes too long to provision, it inhibits the nimbleness of the organization to respond to competitive pressures, why wouldn't something like SDN be attractive to them? And I guess mostly I'm talking to Peter here. There seems, especially when you think enterprises range from, giant organizations down to fairly small ones. So I'm probably leaning more toward like the Fords and the big banks.
Let me give you just two answers. One, the stuff that Aman talked about, if you get into high performance computing, if you went to Intel and talked about a design grid, then the effect of the network to be counterproductive in terms of your server buy is really real. I'm not sure the degree to which that exists in a normal enterprise data center. A really interesting example is how you create virtual networks for applications. A number of the OpenFlow controller and OpenFlow companies in this room had found that getting more network agility looked like a good value proposition for software-defined networks. In the middle of that, VMware, along with partnership with Cisco, introduced something called VXLAN. And VXLAN is a very interesting hybrid of, it's not a network solution, it requires some additional work, which if you had to put it in the network products would take a long time, but lo and behold, if you own a vSwitch or a hypervisor and you can do some basic packet wrapping there, all of a sudden it says, gee, you can solve this problem, it looks like, not bad, by using multicast technology that already exists in routers. So it's an example where there was a pain point that you couldn't solve with conventional networking, but with a little bit of synthetic thinking of maybe we can do some of the networking in the software stack and some in the network didn't require the disruption of SDN. It was solvable more pragmatically. And the interesting question in what you bring up is, as those problems come up, will we find someone where that makes a compelling reason to provide the painful two steps back impetus to use new network, or is it like IPv6 where no one ever found a reason to do it until we absolutely need it? There was never a killer app.
Right.
I have a quick follow-up. I'm not sure why enterprise networks should exist at all. Why don't we just migrate them all to the cloud?
Separate debate.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a follow-up comment on Peter's. I happen to be, just to make the panel a little bit interesting, to be on the other side of the viewpoint. I do believe there is a huge opportunity for SDN in the enterprise. Even in a particular example that we just talked about, using SDN to increase network the agility and virtualization. Indeed, there are techniques like VXLAN. My VMware friend is sitting there and can do certain use case of it. But in the big picture level, what I see is that the two forces, the virtualization capability that's captured inside of the next-gen OS, the hypervisor environment, and the simplification of the physical network by itself is a very large domain. You can't just solve everything from the hypervisor endpoints. It needs to work together. The two forces need to work together. Take Dell as an example. Our SDN strategy, the multi-tenancy use case I talked about, is actually our first major use case, low-hanging fruit on that. And implementation-wise, we leverage both hypervisor-capable virtual networking, including VXLAN, and the OpenFlow on the simplification of the physical network side. I do believe the two needs to collaborate, and further they need to influence each other, not that one against another.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is actually a question really for.
So I think last two questions, then.
Okay, this is inspired by Greg, but it's really for Guru and Amin in particular, maybe for Ed. Which is, Greg, the guys who wrote the killer apps for the PC weren't in the computer science department, right? In fact, the guy who wrote the killer app for the PC was a biz school student. Jerry Yang was a double E student here when he did Yahoo. I think Larry and Sergi were on the Stanford University Digital Library project. So you said the killer app hasn't been invented yet, and the history, right? Maybe it'll be different in networking, but the history is the killer app isn't going to be invented by any of the people in this room. It's going to be invented by some undergrad in his dorm room who wants BitTorrent to go faster or whatever, right? It'll be invented by my 19-year-old son, and he will make me wealthy. Somebody's got to, right? So the question is, and this is why this is really for you guys, the question, and what Jen has done is terrific, right? I mean, it raises the level of abstraction, but if there's nothing to program, all the programming languages in the world won't matter. So the question is, you guys have taken a big step by running the Gates and Allen building on OpenFlow. How do you get that Farmville frat boy that the Juniper guy was talking about, because he's the key guy, right? How do you get him access to this so he can write the killer app?
Amin, you want to say something?
I'm confused about the lack of killer app. I think the killer app is out there, and we're 5 years away from the Farmville on software-defined networking, right? The killer app is running Gates building on OpenFlow and making it a lot easier to do the things that we have to stand on our head sideways to do right now. There's a huge amount of value, right? Just because we don't have every programmer in the world writing OpenFlow apps, that's just fine for now.
So this is the 1,000 lines of SNMP to move a glucose meter down to nothing.
I mean, at most places, I mean, let's put Google and Ericsson and other places aside, there are human beings who go log into each switch individually when I want to plug in a new machine into the network. Okay,
so that's the enterprise use case.
So I'll pick some others for you if you like from the data center space, right? There's just lots of things that are really, really hard right now that should be a lot easier. And these are all killer apps.
And so Rick, so the thing is, unless you actually do SDN, there is no hope for either a computer science or networking or whatever, someone outside the discipline to even be able to have an opportunity to do this, right? Now, whether killer app will come from networking and computer science people or someone outside, it can only come if we do something like SDN. If we stay with the current status quo, it's not going to happen.
But I would just say that and I agree with, that it has to be that this gets out here to address a pain point we've all identified here, right, which is this management and administration thing. For it to go beyond being just a really good hack to being transformational, it's got to be exactly that now that exists and somebody can go write this new application we haven't thought about for. And that, I think that's we'll know it's magic. But we'll only get there if we keep this toolpath.
We're a little bit away from that.
Yeah, we are.
Time.
Okay, last question of the day.
I'm Ed. I think service velocity is the key to survival here. But the question I have for the panel is a bit historical, if you look back at the nature of networking using a bunch of closed systems, I'm going to start with AS1. It had a problem, and I'm going to go to UUNet, WorldCom, MCI, etc. All had the same problem. And you heard from Stu Elby a little earlier that the existing carriers are on a very similar trajectory to an untenable business model. So if we don't do software-defined networking, which in my opinion is the road to vertical monetization, the horizontal pipes have not worked, what are we going to do? Where do you go from here?
It's like the only person who would probably want to answer is Peter, because everyone else has said that the only way to go forward is with OpenFlow and SDN. Yeah. So
Why don't we, let's just nationalize the data transport companies and have it run by the government, paid for by your taxes.
I would hate to close the summit on that comment, so I hope. So maybe, Greg, you want to say something before we close, because I think...
No. It's all good.
Okay. So I think, thank you so much for participating. I think Peter has articulated some challenges for